Imagine planning your future with the man you love only to find out he's planning his future with someone else. My husband's young girlfriend thought she had stolen my billionaire husband, and she even threw a party to celebrate. But what neither of them knew was that the fortune they were counting on had never belonged to him at all. And when I finally revealed the truth, the look on their faces was worth every silent tear I had cried. Stay with me because the twist at the end will leave you breathless. If you've ever stood in a room full of people smiling at you, praising your life, your marriage, your success, while inside your stomach twisted with the truth you couldn't share, then you'll understand where my story begins. From the outside, I was the woman everyone envied. I was Amara Whitmore, the poised wife of Charles Whitmore, a billionaire with charm polished enough to blind anyone who looked too closely. We had the kind of life that belonged on glossy magazine covers, a glass mansion perched on the Malibu cliffs, a fleet of cars gleaming in our driveway like jewels, summers spent between Martha's Vineyard and Tuscany, and a calendar filled with charity galas where the champagne never stopped flowing. People saw us together and whispered, "That's power. That's the perfect couple." I'd smile graciously, shake hands, pose for photos, but inside I often thought, if only they knew. Because here's the cruel thing about perfection. It's rarely as flawless as it looks. And the more polished the surface, the more cracks it's usually hiding. First, I told myself that I was lucky. Charles was everything the world said he was: tall, charming, accomplished, a man who seemed to carry opportunity in his back pocket. He was British-born but had conquered America's business world, taking an old family name and turning it into a powerhouse brand. People respected him, and by extension they respected me. I was more than just a wife, though. I had built my own consulting firm from scratch, with clients across London, New York, and Sydney. I carried myself as a woman who didn't need anyone to complete her, and maybe that's what made people admire me. But admiration doesn't shield you from betrayal. And no amount of money, no estate, no diamond ring, can drown out the ache in your chest when you sense that the person you've given your heart to is slowly slipping away. The first signs were so small, you could almost forgive yourself for overlooking them. Late nights at the office, I told myself, that's just business. He's a man running empires. Who was I to question a calendar filled with meetings I wasn't part of? But then came the phone calls, always stepping out of the room, lowering his voice, putting his phone face down on the marble counter when he came back in. That wasn't the Charles the first had married. I remember one Tuesday night in particular, and I remember it like it happened yesterday. I had been reviewing contracts in our home office, my pen tapping nervously against the edge of the papers. The ocean roared faintly against the cliffs outside, a sound that usually calmed me. But when Charles walked in that night, I caught something stronger than salt air. Perfume. Not mine. Not one I recognized. And in that single second, the air in that perfect mansion grew heavier than I could bear. Now I'm not naive. You don't build businesses from the ground up without learning to trust your instincts. And mine were screaming. But here's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't usually hit like a thunderbolt. It's more like water seeping through stone, slowly, steadily, until one day the whole foundation cracks. Over the next few weeks, little things began to stack up, each one a small wound. Charges on our shared accounts from restaurants we'd never visited together. Jewelry receipts that never resulted in a velvet box handed to me. Hotel stays in downtown Los Angeles, when Charles swore he was working late at the office. He was slipping, and I was catching every detail he thought I'd never notice. But betrayal isn't just in receipts or perfume. It's in the way your partner's eyes avoid yours at dinner. It's in the silence that grows between you when once there was laughter. I would sit across from him, my wine glass trembling just slightly in my hand. Watching him scroll through his phone like the glowing screen was more important than the woman who had once been his whole world. And yet, I didn't confront him, not then. Some people think strength is in storming into a room and demanding answers. But sometimes strength is sitting quietly, absorbing the sting, and preparing for the day when truth will no longer be avoidable. Because confrontation without preparation? That only gives the liar the upper hand. Still, I couldn't shake the question that haunted me at night. Who was she? The answer came sooner than I expected. At a charity fundraiser one autumn evening in London, I saw her. I saw the woman who had been haunting my instincts. Her name, I would later learn, was Sienna. She was 26, with platinum blonde hair, an Instagram-filtered glow to her face, and a laugh that sliced through the ballroom like she owned it. She wasn't shy about who she was there for. Her eyes clung to Charles in a way that made my skin prickle. And when she leaned close, her hand brushing his arm like she had every right, I knew. It wasn't just the perfume. It wasn't just the receipts. It was her. She was the shadow behind every unanswered call, every mysterious late night. And do you know what stung more than seeing her? It was realizing that Charles no longer cared to hide it. He stood there, his hand resting on the small of her back, while I, his wife, stood across the room, heart pounding in my chest, pretending not to see what everyone else surely did. The audacity, the humiliation, the kind of pain that makes your throat tighten, your fists curl at your sides, but forces you to smile anyway because walking out would mean admitting defeat. That night, when I finally sat alone in the back of our black car as it sped through the rain-slick streets of Mayfair, I pressed my hand against the cool glass and whispered to myself, "Hold on, Amara. Just hold on." Because as shattered as I felt, I wasn't about to collapse. I knew then that this story, my story, wasn't going to end with me broken. Not when my ancestors had built empires from the dust of nothing. Not when I had clawed my way into boardrooms that once slammed their doors in my face. No. If Charles thought he could strip me of my dignity, if Sienna thought she could parade into my life and take my place, they were both about to learn one truth. Sometimes the woman you try to erase is the one who holds the very foundation of everything you're standing on. And the day would come sooner than they thought, when I'd remind them of that. The night I first saw Sienna at that fundraiser was the night something inside me shifted. It wasn't just the way she draped herself on Charles's arm like she had rehearsed it in front of a mirror, or the way her laughter rang out like she wanted every head in the ballroom to turn. It was the way she looked at me when our eyes met, bold, unflinching, almost daring me to acknowledge what was happening. She didn't see me as a wife. She saw me as an obstacle, a formality standing between her and the life she believed she deserved. And for the first time in my life, I felt the sting of being made invisible in my own marriage. After that night, she stopped being a shadow and became a presence. Not just in Charles's life but in mine. I would see her in places I never expected, as if she had drawn up a map of my world and decided to invade it piece by piece. At the country club in Malibu, where I usually spent my Sunday mornings playing tennis, she appeared in a white skirt that barely covered her, walking straight past me with her head held high, her manicured fingers twirling the keys to a brand new Porsche. She didn't need to say a word. Her smirk did all the talking. At a gallery opening in downtown Los Angeles, she stood close enough to Charles to whisper in his ear, her lipstick leaving faint traces on his collar as though she wanted me to see. And once, at my favorite restaurant overlooking the ocean, she arrived just minutes after Charles and I had been seated. The maitre d', clearly embarrassed, tried to place her at another table, but she insisted on sitting 2 spots away, laughing too loudly, touching her phone as if waiting for my husband to slip away and join her. The humiliation wasn't private anymore. It was public and it was deliberate. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers from Charles, to shake him until he admitted what was already obvious. But every time I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. It wasn't fear that silenced me. It was the knowledge that if I confronted him without proof, he would spin the story, make me look jealous, paranoid, ungrateful. I had worked too hard in life to be painted as the hysterical wife. So I stayed quiet, but inside the storm was building. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. Charles had left his phone on the kitchen counter, face down as always. I didn't mean to look, but when it lit up, curiosity overcame me. One text. One line that changed everything. "I can't wait for our weekend together. Soon I'll finally be the new Mrs. Whitmore." My stomach turned as though I had swallowed glass. It wasn't just the words, it was his reply that followed seconds later. "I can't wait either. You've made me happier than I've been in years." I stared at that glowing screen until the letters blurred. Happiness. Years. So that was what I had become to him. A placeholder. A partner he had already erased in his mind while I was still carrying the weight of our vows. The man who once swore to protect my heart was handing it over to a woman who saw it only as a ticket to power. That evening, he came home as if nothing had happened. We ate dinner together. The clinking of silverware against porcelain louder than the words we didn't speak. He asked about my day. I answered with polite fragments. We watched a film on Netflix, the glow of the screen casting shadows across a room that had once been filled with warmth but now felt colder than marble. I sat beside him, my body rigid, my mind replaying the text I had read hours earlier. To him it was a normal night. To me it was the night I quietly stopped being his wife in my heart. From that point on, Sienna wasn't just his mistress, she was his declaration. He no longer cared if the world knew. She started showing up at events where she had no reason to be, introducing herself to acquaintances as though she belonged in my circle. I even heard whispers from mutual friends that she was bragging about Charles leaving me, saying things like, "It's only a matter of time before I'm wearing that ring." The audacity burned like acid in my veins. I wasn't just losing a husband, I was being mocked in the process. One evening I attended a charity gala in Beverly Hills, determined to hold my head high. I wore a gown that hugged my frame in all the right places, my hair swept into a crown of braids, diamonds glinting at my ears, a silent reminder that I was still Amara Whitmore, a woman of my own making. But when I stepped into the ballroom I saw her. Sienna, draped in crimson silk, clinging to Charles's arm like she had already taken my place. She turned her head and smiled at me, not kindly, not shyly, but triumphantly, as if she were the winner of a battle I hadn't even realized we were fighting. The crowd buzzed, whispers circling like smoke, eyes flicking between the three of us. In that moment, I realized humiliation had become entertainment for others. My pain was now a spectacle. I excused myself to the restroom, locked the door, and pressed my palms against the cool marble sink. Tears threatened to spill, but I bit them back. I couldn't let her win. I couldn't let him see me broken. My reflection stared back at me, a woman on the edge of unraveling, but also a woman who knew deep down that storms don't last forever. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory, steady and firm. "Never let anyone mistake your silence for weakness, Amara. Silence can be strategy." That night I understood. If Charles and Sienna wanted to humiliate me, let them. If they wanted to celebrate prematurely, let them. Because every performance ends when the curtain falls, and when theirs did, I would be the one left standing. I began to notice something interesting as their arrogance grew. Charles, once discreet, became sloppy. He paraded her in front of people who mattered, thinking their approval was guaranteed. Sienna, emboldened, started dropping hints about their future, speaking as though she was already the new Mrs. Whitmore. They weren't hiding anymore, they were flaunting. And in their flaunting, they were planting the seeds of their downfall. You see, betrayal isn't just about what someone does to you. It's also about what they reveal about themselves. And what Charles revealed was that he was careless. He thought I would crumble quietly, fade into the background while he built a new life. He thought wrong. The night I found that text was the night I began to change. I stopped asking questions I already knew the answers to. I stopped wasting energy on tears that only watered their arrogance. Instead, I began to prepare. Because deep down, I knew something Charles and Sienna didn't. There was a truth about our fortune, about our empire, that they had no idea existed. And when the time came, that truth would turn their smug smiles into silence. Until then, I let them laugh. I let them smirk. I let them humiliate me. Because one day soon the performance would end, and the audience, the world, would see who had really been in control all along. By the time Charles handed me the divorce papers, the marriage had already ended in my heart. What he didn't know was that I had quietly stopped being his wife the moment I saw that message glowing on his phone. But seeing those documents laid out on my mahogany dining table still felt like someone driving a blade into my chest. He didn't even hand them to me himself. He had them delivered by a firm downtown, as if I were a business transaction he was too busy to face. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope, though not from surprise, only from the insult of it all. 4 years of marriage, and I was being reduced to a line item in a file. The terms were aggressive. His attorneys, bold and arrogant, claimed he was the primary breadwinner, and that I had lived a life of luxury solely because of his empire. They demanded half of everything: our homes, our accounts, our businesses, even the vineyard in Sonoma where my family had hosted generations of gatherings. Half of everything I had poured myself into, half of everything my bloodline had built. And the part that almost made me laugh, his papers described me as though I were some socialite who had lounged on velvet sofas while he carried the weight of the world. If only they knew. If only he knew. But the sting wasn't just in the legal claims. It was in the audacity of the timing. Within a week of filing, Charles had moved into a luxury apartment downtown. And who do you think was photographed on the balcony, champagne in hand, draped in a silk robe that wasn't hers to wear? Sienna. She looked like a child playing dress-up in clothes too fine for her. Her smile wide, her hand wrapped around a glass like she had just won the world. And perhaps in her mind she had. She had taken my husband, and soon she thought she would take my fortune too. I remember the first whispers reaching me through mutual acquaintances. Have you heard? She threw a party. First I didn't believe it. But then I saw the photos, candles flickering, balloons spelling out new beginnings. And Sienna in the center of it all, cutting a cake shaped like wedding rings, her eyes glinting with victory. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a mockery. A divorce party. My marriage had become her entertainment, her stage, her chance to announce to the world that she had succeeded. I wanted to be furious, but what I felt was something colder, sharper. Pity. Because what neither of them understood was that arrogance blinds. They thought I was silent because I was broken. But silence, when wielded carefully, is a weapon sharper than any sword. At night, lying in the wide bed in the Malibu house, I would close my eyes and let the memories of our early years flicker across my mind like a film I no longer wanted to watch. The laughter, the whispered promises, the nights of dreaming together about the future, they all felt like ghosts. But ghosts can't hurt you once you stop chasing them. I had stopped chasing. Instead, I was planning. Charles had made one critical mistake in all his arrogance. He assumed that money equaled power, and that his name was the source of that money. He had never bothered to look closer. He had never bothered to ask questions about how every estate deed, every investment, every business expansion had been secured. He had lived in the illusion that it was all his, because I never made a show of correcting him. Why would I? In marriage, you don't draw lines in the sand, you build together. Or at least that's what I believed. But his betrayal had shifted everything. Suddenly, what had once been generosity on my part became my greatest shield. I can still remember the meeting with my attorneys, sitting in the oak-paneled office that had handled my family's affairs for decades. They pulled out file after file, documents yellowed with age but strong as steel, deeds in the name of the Okoye family trust, investment accounts that traced back 3 generations, portfolios diversified across continents, all untouchable, all belonging not to Charles, not even to me individually, but to my bloodline. My grandmother, who had purchased her first plot of land in 1943 when black women weren't supposed to own anything, had laid the foundation of an empire that could not be stolen by arrogance or adultery. And here was Charles strutting around like a king, unaware he had been sitting on borrowed ground all along. Still I kept my silence. Let him believe. Let her flaunt. Because the sweetest justice isn't loud. It's unveiled at the moment when the world expects your defeat. Yet that didn't mean the days were easy. There were moments when the weight of betrayal crushed me. When I stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The humiliation of seeing Sienna in places that used to be mine, of hearing her name whispered by people who once praised me, cut deeper than any legal battle. I would sit alone at night, scrolling through old photos of Charles and me, wondering how many of those smiles had been lies. And yet, beneath the ache, a fire burned. Because every cruel photo, every smug whisper, every celebration she hosted only fueled my determination to make sure that when their curtain fell, it would fall hard. What Charles and Sienna didn't know was that I wasn't just waiting. I was preparing. Every document, every transaction, every record was being compiled by my attorneys. Every business Charles thought was his was being traced back to the trust that had funded it. Even the penthouse downtown, the one where he now paraded her, had its down payment wired from my family's estate account. He thought he had built an empire, but the truth was, he had been a guest in mine all along. There was one evening when I almost broke. I had attended a small gathering of close friends, women who had walked with me through every chapter of my life. As I sipped my wine, one leaned in and whispered, "Amara, why do you stay quiet? Why not confront him, show them who you really are?" For a moment I wanted to. I wanted to storm into his apartment, drag Sienna out by her borrowed hair extensions, and shout the truth to the world. But then I remembered something my grandmother used to say. Revenge shouted in anger fades quickly. Justice revealed in silence lasts forever. So I smiled at my friend, swallowed the ache and said only, "Patience. They'll learn soon enough." And soon enough they would. The weeks leading up to the court hearing felt surreal. Charles carried on as though he had already won, his lawyers boasting about the fortune they would split. Sienna boasted too, posting photos from designer boutiques, flaunting handbags I recognized as being bought with money she didn't understand wasn't hers to spend. I would catch sight of those photos sometimes, her captions dripping with smugness about stepping into the life I was born for. I almost laughed. She wasn't stepping into a life she was born for. She was stepping onto a stage that was about to collapse beneath her feet. And through it all, I remained silent. Not because I was weak. Not because I was broken. But because I was ready. I knew the day was coming when I would walk into that courtroom, look Charles in the eye, and let the truth speak louder than any humiliation they had ever thrown my way. The curtain was rising on their grand performance. But what they didn't realize was that the final act belonged to me. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of heaviness you feel before a storm. I woke before dawn, staring at the ceiling as the first light crept through the sheer curtains of my bedroom. My chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths as I gathered myself for the day I had been silently preparing for all these months. I moved through the house in silence, the marble floors echoing under my heels as if reminding me with every step that this home, my sanctuary, had been built on the foundation of my family's blood, sweat, and sacrifices. Today was not just about ending a marriage. It was about restoring dignity, about proving that arrogance cannot erase legacy. By the time I stepped out into the cool Los Angeles morning, my heart was steady. I wore a black tailored suit, sharp and understated, not to dazzle but to command respect. My lawyers met me at the courthouse steps, briefcases in hand, eyes steady with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you hold the truth. Cameras flashed as we entered, reporters shouting questions about the billion-dollar divorce. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence spoke louder than their speculation. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation. The courtroom was full, friends, business associates, even curious strangers who had come to witness what they expected to be my downfall. Charles sat at the front with his legal team, his face smug, his tie perfectly knotted, every inch of him dressed for victory. Beside him in the gallery sat Sienna, draped in a designer dress that looked borrowed from someone else's life. She crossed her legs slowly, smirked in my direction, and tapped her phone like she was too bored to wait for the show to begin. I met her eyes once and then looked away. Not because I couldn't face her, but because she was insignificant compared to what was about to unfold. The proceedings began with Charles's attorney taking the floor. He was a polished man, confident, his voice booming across the room as he painted Charles as the genius behind our empire. He spoke of his brilliance, his business acumen, his sacrifices, the long hours he had put into building our life together. According to him, I had merely benefited from his success. His words dripped with condescension, crafted to make me look like an ornament, a woman who had simply basked in the glow of her husband's achievements. The crowd nodded, some even sympathetic, as though they were already convinced. It was a performance, and I'll admit, he delivered it well. But performances only last until the curtain falls. When my attorney stood, the room shifted. She was a woman of few but powerful words, her voice steady, deliberate, and unshaken. She began by thanking the court, her tone calm, almost gentle, before she delivered the first blow. Your Honor, the defendant has been presented as the sole source of the wealth in question. But that narrative is not only misleading, it is entirely false. She paused, letting the words settle like a stone dropped in water. Murmurs rippled through the room. I saw Charles's smug expression flicker just for a second. My attorney continued, her words sharp but measured. The assets being claimed in this divorce, the properties, the businesses, the investments were not built on the defendant's earnings. They were funded, supported, and sustained by the Okoye Family Trust, a generational estate established by my client's grandparents and carefully managed for over 80 years. She lifted a file and laid it before the judge, its pages thick with proof. Every property deed, every account, every business venture traces back to that trust. And as such, these assets are not marital property. They belong exclusively to the beneficiaries of the trust, which does not include the defendant. For a moment, silence consumed the room. You could hear the creak of chairs as people leaned forward, the shuffle of papers as Charles's attorneys scrambled to make sense of what had just been said. I turned my head slightly to see his face. The confidence was draining, replaced by confusion, then panic, like someone realizing the ground beneath him was no longer solid. Beside him, Sienna's smirk slipped. She sat up straighter, her hand frozen over her phone. This was no longer entertainment. This was survival. My attorney wasn't finished. She unfolded document after document, deeds signed decades before Charles had ever entered my life, investment accounts in my family's name, prenuptial agreements that he had signed without a second thought, assuming it was just formal paperwork. She read aloud one clause, clear as crystal. All assets tied to the Okoye family trust shall remain separate property, not subject to marital division. The words hung in the air like a verdict delivered before the judge had even spoken. Charles leaned toward his lawyer, whispering frantically, his face pale. His attorney shuffled through papers, flipping pages as though an escape hatch might suddenly appear. But there was none. They hadn't prepared for this because arrogance had blinded them. They had believed their own illusion, never questioning the foundation of the wealth they had been flaunting. The judge reviewed the documents carefully, her eyes scanning line after line. The room was silent except for the rustle of papers and the occasional cough. Time stretched like a taut string, each second pulling tighter. Finally, the judge looked up, her expression firm, her voice clear. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that the majority of assets in question belong to the Okoye family trust. They are not subject to division in this divorce. The defendant is entitled only to assets proven to have been acquired through his individual earnings during the marriage. It was as though the entire courtroom exhaled at once. Gasps, whispers, heads turning toward Charles, toward me, toward Sienna. My husband, the man who had strutted into this courthouse like a king, was reduced in a single moment to a man with almost nothing. His individual earnings? Barely enough to cover his personal expenses. The empire he had boasted of, the wealth he had promised Sienna, had never been his to give. I looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time in months I felt no anger, no heartbreak. Only clarity. The man who had betrayed me wasn't powerful. He wasn't untouchable. He was small, exposed, a figure stripped of illusion. And Sienna, sitting just behind him, looked at him the same way. Her eyes darted from him to the judge, her face paling as though the life she had been dreaming of had vanished before her very eyes. When the judge announced the final calculation, the number was almost laughable.
$52,000.
That was all Charles would walk away with, alongside his personal belongings. $50,000 in exchange for 4 years of betrayal, arrogance, and humiliation. It was poetic. It was justice. And it was devastating for him, for her. I will never forget the moment Sienna leaned back in her chair, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her eyes no longer mocking but calculating. She didn't touch him. She didn't comfort him. She didn't even look at him. And in that silence I knew. Whatever dream she had been chasing had just evaporated, and she was already thinking of her next escape. As we left the courtroom, cameras flashed again, reporters shouting, eager for a soundbite. Charles walked out first, his shoulders hunched, his face gray, clutching the thin file of what remained of his fortune. Sienna trailed behind him, her eyes fixed on the distance, not on him. And then I walked out, not triumphant, not boastful, but free. My dignity intact, my wealth secure. My future brighter than the storm I had endured. What no one else knew in that moment, however, was the truth that gave me strength even in my silence. I had never been caught off guard. I had never been blindsided. For months, long before Charles filed those papers, I had been preparing. I had documented everything, secured what needed to be secured, moved quietly while he thought I was weak. And though today the courtroom had delivered justice, the real victory had been mine all along. Still, as I stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, the cheers of my friends in the background, I thought of my grandmother's words once more. Baby, never let anyone mistake your kindness for weakness. And never let anyone think they built what your family's hands paid for. Today those words weren't just a memory. They were my reality. The storm had broken, the illusion shattered, but the story was not yet finished. Because the final act, the twist that none of them saw coming, was still waiting to be revealed. When I stepped out of that courthouse, the California sun hit my face with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the light, it was freedom, pure and unshakable. Reporters swarmed, microphones stretched toward me like eager claws, questions spilling from their lips, but I didn't stop. I didn't owe anyone an explanation, not the cameras, not the onlookers who had waited to see me fall. I owed only myself the dignity of walking forward with my head high. The clicking of cameras followed me down the courthouse steps, but I barely heard them. All I heard was the rhythm of my heels striking the pavement, each step echoing the truth. I had won not by fighting loud battles, but by preparing in silence. Behind me, Charles trailed out with his legal team. His once proud shoulders slumped like a man who had been stripped of his crown. He avoided the press, ducking his head, muttering something inaudible as he pushed through the crowd. And Sienna? She didn't follow him with the same pride she had walked in with. She slipped out quietly, her phone already in her hand, scrolling with the desperate speed of a woman hunting for her next lifeline. She didn't reach for Charles's arm, didn't whisper reassurances. She kept her distance, her expression cold, calculating. In that moment it became painfully clear. She hadn't loved him, she had loved the lifestyle. And with that lifestyle gone, her loyalty evaporated like mist in the sun. I later heard from mutual acquaintances that by the time Charles reached his luxury apartment, Sienna was gone. She hadn't even waited for the ink on the judgment to dry. She left behind a silk robe, a pair of heels, and an empty promise of forever. By evening, she was seen in another man's car, laughing the same rehearsed laugh she once used on Charles. Karma doesn't send warnings. It just arrives when it's ready. And for Sienna, it arrived swiftly, stripping her of the life she thought she had secured. Charles's downfall was slower, but no less brutal. The man who once walked into rooms with the confidence of a king was now left with $50,000 and his personal belongings. $50,000 may sound like plenty to some, but to a man who had grown used to private jets and champagne on rooftops, it was barely a breath. His businesses, which he had paraded as his own, were suddenly lifeless without the funding from the trust. He tried to salvage what he could, but arrogance does not make up for reality. I heard whispers that he was forced to sell his car collection, that he downsized to a small apartment he once would have sneered at, that he now worked for someone else's company instead of running his own. Every corner he turned reminded him of what he had lost, not because it was taken, but because it was never his to claim. And yet, the sweetest part of it all wasn't watching him lose. It was watching myself rise. For the first time in years I felt weightless. No more second-guessing his late nights, no more humiliation in public spaces, no more silencing my instincts for the sake of appearances. I was free to be me again, not Amara, the billionaire's wife, but Amara, the woman who had built her own firm, who came from a line of visionaries, who knew the value of resilience more than any luxury car could ever teach. After the divorce, I bought a new home in the hills overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Not because I needed another house, but because I wanted a space untouched by betrayal. Every wall, every window, every corner of that house was mine, built from choices I had made, secured by the trust my grandmother had envisioned decades before I was even born. Sometimes I'd stand on the balcony at sunset, the waves crashing below, and whisper, "We made it, Grandma." Because this wasn't just my victory, it was hers too, and my mother's, and every ancestor who had laid a brick so I could stand tall today. But here's the truth no one outside the courtroom knew. I had been ahead of them all along. Months before Charles ever filed for divorce, before Sienna ever celebrated her so-called victory, I had already known about the affair. I had already hired a private investigator who tracked every hotel stay, every jewelry purchase, every whispered secret. I had gathered evidence not because I wanted to fight for his loyalty, it was already gone, but because I wanted to protect what was mine. While he thought I was naive, while he laughed in Sienna's arms about his fresh start, I was transferring assets, updating accounts, separating ventures, securing every corner of the empire my family had built. By the time he filed those papers, I wasn't just ready, I was 10 steps ahead. That's the part that makes me smile even now. He thought he was in control. He thought he was discarding me for someone new, leaving me broken and scrambling. In reality, I was the one who had already moved my pieces on the board. He had been playing checkers while I was playing chess. There were nights during those months when I lay awake, the ache of betrayal heavy in my chest, wondering if silence was the right path. Part of me wanted to scream, to confront him, to demand justice right then and there. But another part of me, the wiser part, remembered that true strength isn't in the noise, it's in the patience. It's in letting people write their downfall with their own hands. And Charles had written his ending line by line, unaware that I was quietly holding the pen all along. People often ask me what the best part of it all was. Was it seeing the look on Sienna's face when the judge declared the assets off limits? Was it watching Charles crumble under the weight of his own arrogance? Those moments were satisfying, yes. But the best part was rediscovering myself. I had spent years bending, compromising, giving pieces of myself to make our marriage look flawless. Betrayal broke that illusion. And once it shattered, I realized I was never meant to be defined by his name or his wealth. I had my own. I always had. Now I run my businesses with more fire than ever. I travel when I want, wake up when I please, and fill my days with people who value me for who I am, not for what they can take. Sometimes I still cross paths with people who knew Charles and me together, and they always ask in hushed voices, "How did you survive that storm?" I smile and tell them, "Storms don't destroy women like me. They water the roots so I grow deeper." As for Charles, the last I heard, he was struggling to keep up with bills, working for someone else's firm. A shadow of the man he once pretended to be. And Sienna? She's back on social media, posting filtered photos with captions about waiting for her king. Some women never learn. Some people never change. And perhaps that's the real tragedy, not that they lost, but that they never grew. The lesson I carried from it all wasn't about money or contracts or even revenge. It was about worth. About never letting anyone convince you that your silence means weakness, or that your kindness means ignorance. I remembered my grandmother's voice, strong and steady. Never let them forget where you come from. Never let them rewrite the story you've already paid for. And in the end, I didn't. To anyone listening to my story, let it remind you. Betrayal may break your heart, but it cannot break your worth. Arrogance may humiliate you for a time, but patience will always bring the truth into the light. And when karma finally knocks, it doesn't knock gently, it kicks the door down. So what would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted him right away? Or would you have stayed silent, waited, and let the truth do the work for you? Drop your thoughts below because I want to know. And if you believe, like I do, that justice always finds its way, then stay with me. There are more stories to tell, more lessons to share, more reminders that storms don't last forever. What comes after is always brighter. If this story made you feel that justice always finds its way, go ahead and like this video so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that arrogance never wins in the end. And don't forget to subscribe because I've got more stories where betrayal meets karma. Now tell me in the comments, what do you think hurts more? Losing love to betrayal, or losing the fortune you thought was yours? I can't wait to read your thoughts.